So we're going to get started a bit early on our next presenter. I hope he's ready. Uh, speaking of someone who has come from the student background and who has also spoken with the Secular Student Alliance previously, I am pleased to introduce you to J.T. Snipes, who is the Assistant Professor of Educational Leadership at Southern Illinois University at Edwardsville. Prior to his faculty appointment, he worked for over 12 years in higher education administration. Currently, JT's research focuses on religion and spirituality in higher education, African American collegiate students, and critical race theory in education. He recently completed his award-winning dissertation titled Ain't I Black Too? Counter Stories of Black Atheists in College. It explores the narratives of secular African American students in higher education. JT's latest edited volume, Remixed and Reimagined, Innovations in Religion, Spirituality, and Interfaith Higher Education, invites readers to rethink religious scholarship and practice in higher education and student affairs. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome on the screen JT Snipes.
Good afternoon. I am so grateful and so humbled to be a part of this uh, anniversary celebration. Mandisa, I am always excited to have the opportunity to hang out with you. I am very sad right now that I'm in St. Louis, Missouri, which is not a bad place, but I would much rather be celebrating with you all in New Orleans. So hopefully y'all are having a good time in the city and enjoying one of my favorite spaces in the world. And I'm not gonna complain too much because this is a celebration. But this is the second time because of COVID that I unfortunately won't be able to make it to New Orleans. So I hope y'all are just absorbing all of the city and all of the greatness and having fun for me. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen, and Sam asked me earlier if I wanted to test, and I was feeling bold. I'm like, I don't need to test. I use Zoom all the time. So the title of my talk this afternoon is really just a reflection over the past decade for me. It's called "Let's Get Free: Christian Reflections on Black Secularism." I'm going to start with a confession. As the title may have given away, I do not identify as secular. I do identify as Black, but I identify as a Christian. And I was honestly humbled and floored by the invitation to be a part of this celebration. Um, I know particularly in spaces where folks have experienced all sorts of oppression, um, identifying as a Christian in a white Christian supremacist society brings a level of privilege and, if I'm honest, at times disdain for what's happened. If we think about the what happened last week with white Christian supremacists storming the Capitol, it's not a good time to identify in that way. So, but I think it's important for me as someone who is aspiring to be an ally to folks who are experiencing oppression based on their belief or lack thereof in any sort of cosmological or religious system. So I just start here, and hopefully you all aren't en masse leaving the session with me identifying as a Christian. But I do want to talk about, from my perspective, the value and what BlackNonbelievers Inc. has done for me personally and professionally. So with that, I'm gonna take us back. So back when Mandisa had hair, or more hair, I should say. She still got it, but back when she had more hair. So this picture for me takes me back to 2012, or actually 2013. 2000 the year, not 2013.
2013.
Yes, thank you. Appreciate the help. I was a graduate student at Indiana University, and I was planning. I was starting to finish up my coursework. It was actually my last semester in the of coursework in the higher ed program at IU, and I still hadn't made a decision about what my dissertation topic was going to be. I could either choose to study my area is higher education and student affairs. At the time, I was working for the Center for Urban and Multicultural Education, which was a research center in our School of Education that did program evaluation in K through 20 spaces. So the initial project for me, what I was thinking about was looking at how administrators in schools of education deal with this rising crop of alternative certification programs, right? That I'm sure that just sounds extremely exciting and interesting to you all, right? um, so I was thinking about that, but I had also recently heard an interview, and I was so grateful this morning to hear Debbie Goddard speak about the campaign. Um, and I I'm an avid NPR listener, and I had to commute from where I lived to my assistantship. So I lived in Bloomington, and my assistantship was in Indianapolis. So for those of you that are familiar with Indiana geography, it's about an hour drive, and I'd often listen to NPR on the way out. Um, and on one of my particular drives to my assistantship, I was listening to Michelle Norris had a show called Tell Me More on NPR, in which she had actually interviewed Alex Jules. And at the time, I was thinking about choosing a dissertation topic that focused on religion and spirituality in higher ed. So I'm driving down the interstate, and I hear about this campaign, which is really benign, by the way, to ask the question about doubts around religion and to have such a vitriolic reaction. I'm from Dallas, Texas. So I remember clearly my mom calling me about, she has a file that she keeps in which she talks about the world going to hell in a handbasket. And this was one of the files in that, right? Like, here's what is happening in our community. So she had actually told me about this campaign. Um, and to me, I was I was utterly confused why in the world this would be threatening to anyone, because it's just asking, saying, hey, if you're doubting religion, you're not alone. There are spaces where people are thinking like you. So I listened to the interview and was just um, I was hooked. There was something that Alex said in particular that tugged at me. He said, I can doubt, but as soon as I use the term atheist, it becomes very difficult. You become an apostate. Why would you want to come out as an atheist? And as a Christian, um, I I I believe in folks' ability to worship and believe, or not to believe, whatever they want. Um, and as you all, as I'm sure all of you are aware, um, there is a term that I use called hyper religiosity that exists within Black spaces. So when we look at the data, Black folks aren't just Christian; they are very Christian, right? Like 78% or 73% of African Americans identify not only as religious, not only as Christian, but as Protestant, right? So it is a huge thing within Black spaces and within Black communities to identify as Christian. So when I heard Alex's interview, um, I thought, this is much more fascinating to study. I began to think about who Alex was as a college student, um, because at the time he talked in the interview. Obviously, he was no longer in school. He was uh, an older adult. So I began thinking, what was Alex like in college? And what sort of spaces helped to support his development? And what were the spaces that detracted from his development? Uh, and that eventually became my research project. So I also want to give honor to Black women who continue, uh, at least in my career, I speak personally, the the good that I've experienced has been at the benevolence and support of Black women, Mandisa being one of them. Uh, when I finished my dissertation in 2017, she was one of the first folks to extend an invitation to come and talk, um, and rolled out the red carpet, allowed me to be in Atlanta and hang out with a community of really thoughtful Black secularists, and to share my work. So um, I'm grateful for her, and I'm grateful for this woman. Some of you may recognize her. This is Sojourner Truth. She is known as a Black abolitionist, and an early suffragette. And she wrote a speech called Ain't I a Woman Too? And the title of my dissertation was called Ain't I Black Too? Narratives, Counter Narratives of Black Atheists in College. And I draw from that famous speech because in it, what Sojourner Truth does is situate herself within this framework. At the time of her speech, there were Black Southerners who were saying that, um, you know, that the argument was that Black women weren't weren't really women. So she situated herself as a woman and as a Black woman. So there was an argument where white women were concerned about getting the right to vote. There was an argument for Black folks who were concerned about getting their freedom. And she sat at this intersection of both race and gender. And the question that I'm asking in my work is at a similar intersection for Black secular folks. It's a little bit different, but within Black communities, there is often a presumption of Christianness. So, what does it mean for you as a Black atheist to violate an assumption of hyper religiosity within Black spaces? And that's what my work looked at. So, as Mandisa shared earlier, I am an assistant professor at Southern Illinois University in Edwardsville, and I'm going to share as quick as I can. As a faculty member, I have a tendency to drone on, but I'm gonna try to move through quickly. The question that I asked in my research was, how do Black atheists construct their identity in college? So some of the frameworks that I used to study this was one, a critical interpretive Afrocentric epistemology. And what that basically means is that how I approach knowledge is from a frame of oneness. So Afrocentricism posits that all knowledge is self-knowledge, and that any sort of separation that we see in the physical and or psychological world, they call those cleavages artificial. And I think the space that I come from, all knowledge is self-knowledge. And that's is essentially what a critical interpretivist Afrocentric epistemology posits. I also drew on the work of sociologists and a deconversion model, looking at how folks move from a space of belief to a space of unbelief. So I use the 5 stages that Smith lays out as a model to think through what a transition could look like. And then I drew from Evelyn Higginbotham's respectability politics, which I think has become uh, a little bit more common in even outside of academic spaces. I heard my cousin, who is a freshman in college, talking about respectability politics. So I think it's sort of seeped out into the mainstream. But these are the 3 things that helped me put together my project. So my findings from this project, I had the opportunity, it was a qualitative study, and I interviewed in depth 8 participants. and asked them to just talk about what their experience looked like. And here is what I found. Now, I present the findings in terms of counter narratives because, again, coming from a critical interpretivist Afrocentric epistemology, it's important for me to lay out what society is saying about this group and what this group says about itself. In terms of my critical approach, what I wanted to do in this study is give voice to how this marginalized group is speaking back to those that seek to dominate and essentially erase this space within Black communities. So the dominant narrative that my participants talked about fighting against, and in hopefully there'll be enough time for us to have some question and answer. I'd love to hear from those of you that may no longer be in college or never went to college, how these findings align with your own experience. But what my participants shared is that the dominant narrative they're always fighting against is this idea that atheism is not something that Black folks do, right? This is outside of our community. But the counter narrative is that Black atheists are here. And I think Mandisa's work and the work of other organizers make clear that Black atheism is not aberrant, it's not invisible, but it is present and it is continuing to grow. So here's some of the things that my participants shared in relation to that theme. This is Bill, who coincidentally is related to Zora Neale Hurston. So I think it's a nice sort of connection to the awardee. And I was thinking about Bill as you were talking about this year's winner. What Bill shared is that in traditional families, we gather around the table for Thanksgiving, join hands, and pray, thanking God for what he's done. He talked about he had a Christian family and a secular side. So his father's family was secular, mother's family is Christian. So there's the like Christian Thanksgiving where people are joining hands, praying. There's the secular family in which he talks about what he calls a humanist prayer. And instead of thanking God for what he's done, they thank each other and honor each other. Um, he talked about there are no heads bowed or eyes closed, just a validation of the family that exists. And a lot of my participants talked about the value of community and being able to connect with spaces like BlackNonbelievers Inc. And spaces around their community, and wanted to push back against this notion that Black secularism is something that doesn't exist within communities writ large. The second finding was around this question of immorality. My participants often talked about having to navigate it, and it could be burdensome. Um, for them, the question of immorality wasn't important. For them, like whether you have a moral system or not, for my participants, they just wanted to be treated like human beings, right? Like just give me the respect that you give another human or should give another human. Um, and in relation to that theme, there was also a sense of engagement for my participants, right? I love Roxana's quote, the first one up here. She identified as a polyatheist. And I think there's some playfulness in terms of engagement with different religious and or secular worldviews. She states unequivocally that there are several deities that she does not believe in. And I like this quote because it's an openness to engage with whatever it is that you believe or don't believe. She is here for that conversation. And she says, even though I disagree with it, she wants to have the conversation, which I was grateful for. And then Justice, who I really appreciated in terms of her own experiences, she talked about Christianity being a weight that drug her down, that drowned her, and that becoming a secular humanist was freeing, that she likes the person that she is outside of a Christian framework. There's more freedom to pursue her passions. And she's just a kinder person. Now, I don't want to generalize these sorts of experiences, but it is to speak back against the system that says to not believe in God is to inherently be immoral or evil. And I think what my participants want to do is engage and transform that narrative about about secular communities in general, but about Black secular communities in specific. And then the last thing I'll share is about the space that I work. So as a faculty member, oftentimes colleges and universities can be seen as spaces of reason, right? Like it is the height of reason to be a faculty member. It is the height of reason to teach and instruct folks. But what my participants found is that higher education and colleges and universities are some of the most caustic spaces for secular folks to be, Black secular folks in specific. Um, and this finding that I have on the screen, higher education is a space that holistically develops students. The counter narrative is that college had little, if any, impact on shaping their atheist identity. Um, and as someone who has a history in student affairs, supporting students, supporting their development, supporting their growth, this was a really hard truth for me to grapple with, that colleges are actively hostile and largely steeped in what I call Christian normativity and white Christian supremacy. So how do we, as faculty, as staff, and even as I'm working with others, with students on campus, how do we make these spaces more hospitable, welcoming to secular folks? So that's what I found. Um, the overview for me in terms of my research and work is that we still see respectability politics at play. What drove me to do this work, again, is thinking about how these identities, particularly for Black secular folks. It was amazing for me doing the dissertation research, how many people would out themselves as secular as soon as I brought up the topic. Um, and I think for some folks and for some of my participants who chose not to disclose their identity, um, it is it's draining, and I feel like I may be preaching to the choir, so y'all forgive me and forgive the analogy that I just used. But um, there's a sense of respectability, and in terms of resisting systemic oppression, we have to um, be willing to transgress. And I don't push my participants or folks who identify as secular to openly identify because of the social cost, because it's tiring. Um, but I do think there's a role for folks like myself as um, supposed allies to this community. I think we have to speak up and make sure that we're creating space for folks to identify differently and to not assume that all Black folks are going to church, right? I think that was a thing that my participants brought up fairly regularly, is the question of where do you go to church? What sort of community are you a part of? And at least in predominantly Black spaces, I see it as my role to disrupt that narrative that all of us are Christians, that Christianity is our culture and our heritage. And then the second piece that's important is that when we think the word to predominantly white secular communities is that if we didn't know already, racism is present and continues to be present. So how are these spaces being made for different or different racial identities in secular spaces? So that's my work. I also have a book coming out that is out already, that speaks in depth about Black secular students on college campuses. If you want to read more, uh, check out the book. And with that being said, I'll close and see if there are any questions or comments.
In case you can't hear that, JT, the in-person audience is clapping. So, thank you very much for your very informative and wonderful presentation. One of the best things about this work is encountering really good allies to us. And even though our experiences can be a bit isolating and we can feel that exhaustion, it is good to know that there are folks on our side. So we do have time for questions. If there's anyone in the audience who has questions for JT, now is the time to ask. Okay. Got Phil over here.
Yeah, I wanted to ask on that one of the last slides that you said you were talking about your findings around the narrative that colleges are hostile to religious beliefs, but your findings said that it had little impact on atheism, like the formation of atheistic beliefs. And I was wondering, like, so my experience, I definitely understand the part about reinforcing their religious experience. Like even on my university, there was a Baptist student ministry on campus. They are one of the only institutions that actually have a building on campus, that type of thing. But when I was there, that's where I was exposed to so many different religions. When I was in the computer science engineering program, I was exposed to a lot of different belief systems and a lot of different aspects around that, and that kind of guided my journey a little bit on that. And so I was wondering if it could be a little bit of both, I suppose, on for the college experience. You know, it has an effect. Like there's a lot of things that are insulatory for religion, and a lot of things that are kind of gathered around it, I would say. But there's also those aspects of being exposed to those different cultures, those different lifestyles, and actually getting a better understanding of the differences between myself and my fellow students that kind of helped me on my journey.
No, I appreciate it. That's a good point. And one of the things I want to clarify is that so college is really good at developing students intellectually, right? Like there are certain sets of experiences that you're going to have in the classroom. And one of the things that my research was focusing on is to what extent do colleges and universities serve to develop a Black atheist identity? So when Christian students go to college, and what the literature shows us is that universities are really good at developing Christian beliefs and identities, right? Um, Universities are not very good at helping support the development of someone who comes into the space as an atheist understand better what it means to be an atheist, right? So when we have conversations about spiritual development on our campus, it it always focuses on it. Whenever we're talking about spiritual development, what we're talking about is Christian development, right? And so that's a problem for everyone that doesn't identify as Christian. And that's what I meant in my work, is that the development in terms of better understanding your identity as an atheist was marginal for these participants, right? Whereas the development of a Christian identity in college was much greater.
Awesome. And there's a question from the online viewing audience that I thought was a very good one. Was there, what fraction of your or what percentage of your participants, if you know, entered college as atheists versus what is the percentage of them entering college as atheists, or were there, or those who became atheists during college? Did your research go into that at all?
One of the questions I asked for my participants is at what point I asked them to tell me their journey. How did you become an atheist? And only one participant became atheist during college. The rest of them were atheists before they entered, which I think is an important point. And I haven't had a chance to really dig deeply into the report that just came out. But one of the findings was that very fact that I think sometimes we think about atheist identity as something that folks come to later in life. And that may have been true of older atheists, but of the current generation, most folks are identifying as atheists in middle school, in high school, before they even reach the gates of college. So, and it's partly because of the secular organizing efforts. There are people who are actively working with high schoolers, with middle schoolers, to help broaden and give language to. So I think we're only going to see more of that. And it actually shocked me when I did the research, because at the time I started, there was so little, particularly on college students who identified as atheists, and nothing that looked at, well, when did you actually become atheist? So I think you are going to see an increasing number of atheist students entering college campuses. And as an administrator, or as a former administrator, I'm trying to encourage my colleagues to think about what it means to support secular organizing efforts on campus and secular identities within academic and co-curricular spaces.
Yeah, one more question. What is the possibility of an atheist studies graduate or doctorate program, and what do you think that would look like?
It's a possibility. I think there are people in religious studies that have been looking at secularity for a long time. I think there are people in the sociology of religion that looks at atheist studies, and there's actually a network of scholars currently that it's the Atheist Research Collective. So there's a group of scholars who are looking at atheism. Um, I would be very excited to be a part of a atheist studies program, but it gets really, as you may or may not know, um, the academy is a very territorial space. So the development of anything new, I think religious studies would, and I don't know, I'd be interested if there are any religious studies faculty on the call, what they think of it. But I think religious studies would say, you're part of us. Why are you trying to split away from us? So I think if the politics of that could be navigated, then we would have had an atheist studies program already. Um, but maybe in like 50 to 60 years from now, we can have an atheist studies program. I don't know.
But thank you so much, JT. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we appreciate the information. Thank you once again. JT Snipes, everyone.